Welcome to today's webinar. The title is What Do Snapmaps, DMs, and Pop Culture Have in Common? Unpacking Toxic Tropes and Their Influence on Adolescents and Emerging Adults. I'm Sarah Brandspiegel. I'm the Director of Outreach for the Injury and Violence Prevention Center, and I'm filling in today for Dr. Emmy Betts, who usually moderates these sessions. This event is part of the Research to Practice webinar series. It's a collaboration between the Injury and Violence Prevention Center at the Colorado School of Public Health and the Department of Emergency Medicine at CU Anschutz. Thanks for joining us today. If you're listening, please type in the chat your name and where you're joining us from so we can get a sense of who's attending today. And before I introduce today's speakers, I want to ask you to mark your calendar for our next webinar. It'll be on February 8th, and the focus will be prevention of elder abuse through the Vulnerable Elder Services Protection and Advocacy team called VESPA. Same time, noon Mountain Time. So today we'll be hearing about how the digital world and popular culture shape a larger social context that influences human behaviors and experiences, especially the critical developmental periods of adolescence and emerging adulthood. We'll hear learnings from empirical studies on the relationship between digital technology, pop culture, and human behavior, including violence risk and related issues. Our speakers will provide some nuanced angles on this topic. And attendees throughout the session, you can enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure to hold some time at the end for questions and discussion. So I'm happy to introduce our two speakers today. First, Rachel Kennedy is an East Coast native who moved to Colorado and joined the Betts team in the Department of Emergency Medicine in July 2021. She's a registered nurse with over 5 years of experience helping to implement large mixed methods, developing mHealth decision aid tools to support survivors of intimate partner and dating violence, both in the US and Kenya. She has an MPH and nursing degree from Johns Hopkins University, and she's finishing her PhD in nursing there as well. Her research interests include violence and suicide prevention, developing sustainable resources for vulnerable populations, and community-based gender-inclusive research. We also have Dr. Amy Bonomi. Dr. Bonomi is founder of Social Justice Associates, an award-winning professor and founding director of the Women's Leadership Institute at Michigan State University. She's the author of more than 150 articles and essays on bias, gender equity, and violence prevention. As founder of Social Justice Associates, Dr. Bonomi has guided thousands of individuals and teams in DEI quality improvement strategy within business, education, health, legal, and nonprofit settings. Prior to founding SJA, she was professor and department chair at Michigan State University. So we're so happy to have you both here today. I'm going to turn the floor over, starting with Rachel Kennedy.
Hi, everyone. One second, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Is everyone able to see that okay?
Let's go.
Great. So, sorry, I'm having a quick technical difficulty. Okay, all clear. All right, so hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Kennedy. I'm a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. I'm also a professional research assistant here at University of Colorado School of Medicine. I'm honored to share with you today some of the findings from my dissertation research, which has led me down a very scary and sometimes confusing world of online teen dating. To give a brief background on myself, I know Sarah just gave a quick bio, but I'm a nurse by training, but I've spent most of my professional career developing resources for violence and suicide prevention. So my main focus to date has been working to support survivors of intimate partner violence or dating violence. But leading up to my doctoral studies, I was increasingly interested in addressing the interpersonal conflict and violence that happens earlier in life, because as we know, these things can, exposures to violence and experiences of violence can lead to lifelong patterns that impact relationships later in life. And so I was a member of a team at the time working to develop a decision aid for teens who were in unhealthy relationships, and I was part of the formative team doing qualitative interviews. And so I took the opportunity to better understand what seemed to me the most pertinent aspect of their social lives, which was the online world. So what does it mean to be a teenager in the online world? Well, the first question you may ask, or at least the first question that I ask myself is whether online conflict or things that are happening online, all that consequential? Does it really impact us teens the same way as in-person conflict? And if so, how do teens handle those issues? What resources, if any, are available to support them when things go wrong? So these are some of the many forms of social media here. But to better understand the types of conflict and how they impact teens, I focused on a type of conflict called digital dating abuse. DDA is what I refer to it here. It's basically an umbrella term for the patterns of behavior to control, or pressure, or threaten a dating a partner online or using a phone. There's a lot of different ways that this term has been operationalized, and I strongly encourage anyone who looks into online conflict or violence or dating abuse to look at the operational definitions for these terms because they drastically vary. However, they typically include a range of behaviors from direct threats, insults, or harassment to monitoring and controlling behaviors, kind of historically in the stalking bucket, and then fake accounts or posing as someone else online, and then demanding or sharing intimate photos. So these are some of the most frequent big hitters. So the purpose of this dissertation was to understand how these experiences impact adolescents, place them into context, and understand the association of these experiences with depressive and anxiety symptoms in particular. We had 3 aims. I'm only going to focus on my qualitative findings for today, but just to give you a little context for some of the other things that I did as part of the study, the first 2 aims were drawn from a larger RCT that's going on. I took from a baseline survey for an RCT that is sampling teens around the country to test a decision aid online. And so I was able to look at the frequency of their digital dating abuse experiences and look at how the relationship of those experiences with depressive symptoms in particular, and looking at gender as a moderator variable. So I was only powered to look at differences in gender identity, but I was really eager to include something at the individual level to really understand whether there were some characteristics or identities that really had an impact on these situations that we could be looking out for. So my dissertation was guided by an adapted version of the Diathesis stress model. This is a conceptual model that basically organizes things into buckets of stress, vulnerability, and resiliency. So like a good example would be social connectedness. How well are you connected with your support system? That could be a level of vulnerability, resiliency, and how you handle digital dating abuse and how it impacts your health outcomes. So that's the way I approached this from a kind of basic conceptual standpoint. For my 3rd aim, I was really focused on those aspects of vulnerability and resiliency. And so I was really hoping to understand and place into context what happens when things go wrong online, and then how does that play into the bigger picture of these other big categories. So to be eligible for this study, you've had to be between 15 and 17 years old. They had to live in the US, and they had to have at least one experience of digital dating abuse. As started noted on this slide, there were a few adjustments that I had to make to the recruitment. As with COVID and teenagers, there was a lot of changes at the time, but thankfully being able to expand my recruitment to national recruitment instead of just from Maryland, which is where I was based at the time, and then also being able to expand their recollections of when things had happened, because nobody could get their timelines right, which is understandable given the quarantine. So we made a few adjustments. We're able to complete recruitment between March and October of 2021. I used an online convenience sample using snowballing, and very grateful to have the help of Youth Advisory Board and some colleagues who were very generous to post to their social media accounts on my behalf. So thank you to anyone who helped me in that regard. To be eligible for the qualitative interviews in this dissertation, though, teens had to verify having experienced at least one of the following types of digital dating abuse. But I'll go ahead and note this later, though, that I quickly realized that these are capturing issues on the surface level, but there are much more complicated things going on. And some of those things are a lot more distressing than what we are capturing here. And so it's been a kind of fascinating journey of finding out what they consider to be toxic or abusive versus what we've been measuring in some of these studies. To understand and place things into context, I used semi-structured interview guides. And this included questions about their own dating experiences, perceptions of norms and experiences and expectations around them, what they like about technology, what they don't like about technology, how it influences their relationship quality, and all of it. And so in order to place their actual personal experiences into context, though, I did something called a timeline activity. If you want to sound really fancy, you can call it a biographical mapping activity. But basically all it is I had teens draw out on Zoom, the Zoom whiteboard feature. They just draw out their experiences on the timeline and place them into kind of a sequential order of how things happened. And what we did was we were able to use that as a visual aid for when we talked about all these different things that were going on that were kind of external to the situation. We were able to draw it back into their experience and use this as a grounding for the conversation. And so, as you can imagine, though, participation in the timeline activity varied. Here's one, what I will call a maximalist approach from a participant 5 over in Maryland, whereas we had some more minimalist approaches to timeline activities like here in Alabama. But it didn't really matter. Most of actually, the only thing I was really focused on was what they were saying. So these visual aids were really helpful for guiding conversation and getting better narratives. But really, the analysis was focused on what was said. So I took audio recordings, transcribed them verbatim, and uploaded them into a qualitative coding software called Deduce. I used directed content analysis, which is basically just saying I used that conceptual model that I had talked about earlier and used that to guide what I was looking for in the transcripts. But then I also allowed for some themes to kind of arise on their own because there was a lot of unpredictable things in these conversations. And then I had 2 wonderful research assistants who helped me with member checks, making sure that codebook development was on track and looking for theme saturation. Following that, I was able to organize everything into like different tables and to understand, interpret the different themes, looking at it through these different matrices. So what were my results? First of all, though, my sample, I've interviewed 20 teens from across the country. Most of them are from the East Coast, some from the South, and then a few from Colorado. Thank you again to anyone here in Colorado who may have reached out. The pronouns were predominantly she, her, so most people identified as a girl or a woman in this study. However, I had a little bit of variety there and did have some boys as well as one transgender youth. I was thankfully able to get a little bit of diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, as well as age. In terms of the types of DDA that they experienced, going back to the list of eligibility criteria of what they needed to screen for in order to be enrolled, the vast majority of participants were reporting things on the right side of the screen. So there were some experiences discussed that were outside of what was listed here, and several teens talked about being pressured into staying into relationships through other means. So one that was really common was being pressured to stay into relationships by threat of a partner to engage in risky behavior or to do something outlandish or to engage in self-harm. So there was a lot of concern over taking responsibility for their own mental health as well as the mental health of the person that they were talking to or dating. This is one example that's particularly notable. You can take a gander at reading this, but don't worry, you don't have to speak teenager to read this. I have a translated version. This is just taking out all the likes and ands. Basically, she says here that she tried to exit, but that he persuaded her into staying in the relationship by kind of doing some emotional manipulation. And what was striking to me about this is not necessarily that it happened. We know that these things happen, but I was talking to a 17-year-old girl who had been screened for something completely different. And we spent almost the entire interview talking about something that happened 2 years ago. And so this was such an important part of her journey and understanding what relationships were like and what to expect from relationships, that it became very clear to me that some of the things that were happening online were really complex, and there was a lot of active considerations that were going on when it came to how they are dating other people and what they're thinking about when it comes to how to approach a relationship online. So when it came to understanding that, the list of active considerations kind of seemed endless, to be honest. But the first one on the list, and perhaps the most frequently cited challenge to these relationships, was ensuring that people were who they said they were. That was clearly a concern, and being fresh out of COVID, where everyone was online, establishing a relationship online was kind of the only option teens had during 2020. So most of these stories were built off this idea that they may or may not have known the person on the other side of the screen. And so this led me to my most controversial question, which is, how do you establish trust online, or can you? As you will see, this definitely varied by participant. So we have, you definitely can, or you definitely can't. But these definitive statements aside, teens demonstrated that trust online is extremely important to them, and that it's often the most difficult aspect of the relationship. So I kind of probed into this. I was curious, like, how do you learn to navigate these scenarios? And let's just pretend I'm your age. What was some advice you would give me if I were trying to navigate this? Not surprisingly, all of the lessons that they shared with me, a lot of sage wisdom, a lot of it came from things that they had seen online, things that they had seen in kind of the larger media world, as well as things that they had heard from their friends. There were some firsthand lessons that had been learned, but it was very interesting. Most of the advice I was getting was kind of from these like broad spectrum norms and expectations. This is one example that kind of draws a specific gender norm. I'll go ahead and give you a second to read through it. And so, as you can see here, while most of the advice I received was generic, like how to protect your passwords, don't share too much personal info, things like that, some of this advice was much more gender or age specific. And so when it came down to gender differences, I was kind of at a loss, because again, this was another very controversial question. Are there gender differences? Answers varied across all participants. As you can see here, some boys are the pushy ones, and others disagree that girls were more clingy and pushy. Communication styles were all over the map. But there were some aspects of gender and identity and norms and expectations that kind of seemed consistent across interviews. One was the tendency for people to talk to multiple people at a time, and another, particularly for boys, and then another is for girls to send intimate or sexual photos to either their partners, or even a lot of times it was peers or adult predators too that they discussed. So we saw all sorts of different people who were interested in these photos that they were getting requests from, and so pressure was not simply from partners. However, across the board, it seemed to be an issue for girls, but more so than boys. I saw 2 or 3 boys who reported similar issues that they had seen with their friends, but nothing had been reported directly. So I would love to do more research into this and understand a little bit more about what these trends are like. These norms and expectations, what often started as a conversation about personal experience or perception, often evolved into a complex discussion about gender norms, expectations, and the exposure to these trends online. Often these norms and expectations were seen as harmful. So there's a lot of harmful norms out there that they were picking up on. One of the big ones was online image imperfection. I cannot tell you how many times people talked about the need to look perfect online. And so trying to understand what perfect means, especially online, I looked at, or I asked them questions about where they got this idea of image and how important it really was to their everyday lives. Here's one example. The perfect online image was seen as central to the dating process. This was expressed by several people. And a lot of times, this idea of perfection was being drawn from larger things that they were seeing from their friends, as well as online media. I heard a lot of references to Netflix shows. I heard a lot of references to YouTube videos. I heard a lot of references to well-known figures who are shared online that they are exposed to on a regular basis. So to kind of drive home the impact that those experiences and exposures have on teens, this 15-year-old, I'll leave you with this and transition over to Amy, but this 15-year-old astutely observed that these norms and expectations are not always do not always lead to healthy behaviors. And so in particular with this idea of online image of perfection, he's noting here how this can really impact the relationship quality, and where we get these norms and expectations can really be derived from these macro level influences and have an impact on how we live out our relationships online. So thank you so much. I will stop share. And I will hand it over to Amy, who I believe is going to be talking about the kind of those larger macro trends and how they all trickle down into those relationships. So
thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I'll pull up my presentation in a second. I just want to say, Rachel, thank you so much for your presentation, which I thought was so beautiful, setting us up for thinking about contextual factors related to relationship violence. And I really appreciated how your work connected it specifically to what was happening during the pandemic and showed specific examples. Just really love that, as well as your model. I know Sarah already did a brief introduction to me, just a background context. Most of my work in relationship violence has been in the area of domestic violence recantation. I do a lot of work with the FBI, the US Department of Justice, and helping with them with some of the more complicated cases, including those occurring during the pandemic, as to why domestic violence victims recant. My work in pop culture, which I'm going to talk about today, my interest in that started at Ohio State when I was a professor there, teaching human sexuality and relationship and violence course. And during one of my graduate courses, as we were studying domestic violence models and domestic violence definitions, my students were saying, this sounds a lot like the relationship in 50 Shades of Grey. And that theme kept coming up and kept coming up. And so we ended up that semester taking the second half, abandoning our readings and applying national definitions to 50 Shades of Grey to better understand and exemplify how that relationship was very similar to what we're seeing in real world domestic violence relationships. What I'm going to talk to you about today, we're tracing it back to Disney films and looking at the ways in which early ideas in romantic relationships depicted in those films kind of set the stage for particular girls and women's vulnerability in violence, exposure to violence. So here we go. So romance and pop culture. I wanted to start with some resources. I'll pop these in the chat as well. If you or somebody that you know has experienced or is experiencing dating abuse or domestic violence, got resources here that are available 24/7. This is a brief context. As we know, many films, including those starting in early childhood, depict problematic relationships under the guise of romance and love, and we'll go more deeply into that in the next couple of slides. So one of the questions in the research field is, even if film only represents fiction or fantasy, how do ideas from those films get translated into expectations for real world relationships? And I think Rachel's research just a minute ago touched upon some of that, as well as how do adolescents uptake these messages. So I'm going to talk about a few recent examples, recent research on our research on romantic relationships and expectations for real world relationships. So I'm going to start with something called the virgin beast trope. And if we were in person, I would ask you to raise your hands, and just a show of hands of how many of you have heard the concept of virgin beast trope. Maybe you can even pop that in the chat, yes or no. What is it? So it is a common storyline in many romance and love films. And what it means is, it means that it's a relationship that shows a very passive female who's typically cast as a virgin or a beauty. paired with an aggressive male. So if we think of the very classic example of Beauty and the Beast, here's a virgin, vulnerable, beautiful female paired with an aggressive, literally a beast in this film. In these relationships, males are typically depicted as having more power, meaning money, physical power, physical looks, etc. And the female's only source of power tends to be attached to or ascribed to her beauty. And we'll talk about that in just a minute in the next slide. This virgin beast trope idea dates back to the 1700s with Beauty and the Beast. And it's really seen pervasively throughout Disney princess films. So what do we see, for example, across The Little Mermaids, Sleeping Beauty, Beauty and the Beast? We see a very dominant male pursuing a submissive female, which is, of course, consistent with societal expectations for traditional gendered relationships, quote, the male-female binary expectations. The relationships depicted in these films tend to have what we call dramatic challenges. So the idea that love can overcome anything, or forbidden love. And most of these, the females are taken away to a castle or a forbidden location and separated from family and friends. Also depicted in these is this idea of easy connection, this idea of love at first sight. And we think about any romantic films, regardless of whether it's Disney or even romantic films we see characterized for adults, there's often this love at first sight element, and it should be able to conquer all. So what tends to happen to the princess in these films? Our research shows that she tends to suffer losses. So if we think about Ariel, for example, giving up her voice and her father and sisters for Prince Eric and the Little Mermaid, as just mentioned, she tends to be isolated or trapped in dungeons. So that's the case of Beauty and the Beast, attics in the case of Cinderella, towers in the case of Tangled, Sleeping Beauty, palaces, and hourglasses in the case of Aladdin. The female character typically tends to significantly alter identity, and I've already alluded to this. For example, in the Little Mermaid, she turns from a mermaid into a human, etc. I'm going to insert this slide as well, because we're not going to talk specifically about race or sexual orientation identity today, but as an LGBTQ scholar myself, one of the things that I look at is how is intersectional identities represented in these films. So if you think, for example, about Princess and the Frog, the messaging around race there, race scholars have really said, the fact that Tiana turns into a frog for the majority of the film, so she becomes in non-human form, she disappears for most of the film, renders her in a way as animalistic and not relevant in the storyline. So just keeping that in the back of our in our mind as we go through the material together. So what? These are only fantasy. These are fictional storylines. Well, Disney princess films promote this idea that romantic love requires suffering and transformation. In particular, it primes girls in grade school and adolescence to be primed to focus on their looks, while they wait for their Prince Charming, only to learn that there's no effortless happy ever after. What is the message for boys? So my focus today is primarily on what does it represent for cisgender girls. What is the message for boys? Boys in these films tend to be primed to be aggressive and pardoned for bad behavior. I'm not suggesting there's a causal relationship here, but it sets the context for understanding and behavior. So I'm going to kind of stop here just for 30 to 60 seconds. If you could pop into the chat, do you agree or disagree with what I've shared so far? Can you think of other examples from Disney films that maybe show a passive, submissive female paired with a more aggressive male? If you don't agree with some of the things that I've shared already, where do you see differences? So I'll just maybe take 60 seconds here and see what comes up in the chat. Anyone? Mostly agree what you're saying, or what comes to mind? Are there other films that you can think of that haven't been covered? Yeah, see the newer Disney films having more empowered female characters, less romance. Absolutely, Sarah. Yep, Mulan is a good example. Yeah, it tends to be most prevalent in movies that are older, right? So we're seeing some shifting in terms of the way representation and dynamics are cast in film. So thanks for engaging that, which we had a couple of hours together to explore in more detail. So does this really matter in the real world? When we look at some of the media literacy models, there is something called the sexual media practice model, which really is the idea that in early childhood and early adolescence, when we're engaging in film and interacting with pop culture, we're first learning about romantic and sexual experiences, possibly without having those sexual experiences yet, although of course, for some, they may have already had sexual experiences, positive and negative. And then when we move into middle and late adolescence, we tend to be we're still learning, but we're also practicing romantic relationship norms through observation and experiences. So when we're in that later developmental period, film's providing ways for us to solidify or understand relationship experiences. And this is referred to as the media selection effects. So if we think about its messages for real world behavior, does the virgin beast trope exist only in Disney princess films? As you can imagine, the answer is no. So here's a few images of 365 Days, 50 Shades of Grey, Twilight. As I mentioned, our team had done an in-depth analysis of 50 Shades of Grey. And found that the relationship in that particular film really mimicked what we see in real world domestic violence relationships, similar to the definitions that Rachel talked about earlier around emotional abuse, physical violence, et cetera. When I asked my college students, I taught at Michigan State University through May of 2021 before I started my company. Students in my human sexuality class, we looked at this issue specifically, and they completed a survey. Their responses to where are they seeing the virgin beast trope in films that are characterized for their generation. 365 Days, You, Vampire Diaries, Gossip Girl, Bridgerton, and Grease. Bridgerton shocked me a little bit. I've watched Bridgerton, and I have to admit, while I'm attuned to relationship violence behaviors and the virgin beast trope, I didn't necessarily see it off the bat when I was first watching it. But after they pointed out in our discussions in class, really enlightened my ideas in there. So I'm sorry, after was the most popular, most common answer. So in terms of, I would again ask for a show of hands of how you've seen the film after, but basically students in class, and the highlight here said, Hardin is the male in this film, Tess is the female. It seemed like it was love at first sight. And even when Hardin told Tessa he couldn't stay away from her, Tessa was a virgin woman who was very shy and that she has goody two-shoes appearance. And Hardin, the male, is cast as having this I don't care attitude about life and was very brooding in the film. So they're picking up very much on the elements of the virgin beast trope. Also in that film, Tessa's a freshman in college. Hardin is older. She doesn't have more friends when she's first coming to school, whereas he does. She tends to suffer a great loss in the film. She breaks up with her high school boyfriend to be with Hardin. So we see a lot of this kind of similar patterns. So how do we address this? And I think I've got just a couple of minutes here. So a few years ago, and after we finished our analysis of 50 Shades of Grey, and I'm jumping around from adult film to Disney film, we developed something called the abuse litmus test. And the idea behind this test was really how to help film viewers or moviegoers analyze the power dynamics within relationships characterized in film. So there were 3 questions as part of the abuse litmus test. The first was, do partners share equal power? If not, is power used by one partner to control the other? And if yes, is harm suffered as a result? And you can see off the bat, there are some problems with the way that this is initially constructed. So if we think about the idea, do partners share equal power? Some of us, if we reflected on our relationships, we might say, yeah, generally speaking, there's equal power between myself and my partner in the relationship. But that fluctuates, right? From moment to moment. It can fluctuate from week to week to some standpoint. But really, when we're thinking about healthy relationships, is to even out the levels of power in relationships. So let's go more deeply into the abuse litmus test. So if we take that first question, do partners share equal power? What are we talking about there? We're talking about having respect in sexual and physical intimacy, engaging in non-threatening communication, respectful negotiation and shared decision-making about money, resources, children, needs, sex, trust and support in the relationship, honesty and accountability, And then understanding the acknowledges that we and our partners might carry and privilege around gender, age, race, ethnicity, ability, politics, access to institutional knowledge. In the case of college life, for example, access to grief, right, can create power imbalances in relationships. That second question is power is used by one partner to control the other. What are some of the things that we would ask moviegoers to reflect there on? Would include things on the spectrum of sexual violence, physical violence, punching, hitting, slapping, kicking, misuse of privilege, also treating a partner like a servant, defining very rigid roles in the relationship around gender or race, controlling the finances and resources, displays of jealousy, including expected social and sexual exclusivity. We think about healthy relationships in adolescence. The presence of jealousy in a very profound way is one of the most significant warning red flags that we see in those relationships, and can be an indicator of early warning signs for relationship abuse. Coercion, threats, and intimidation, emotional abuse, such as name calling, humiliation. Sometimes that's done under the guise of a joke, which often in the cases is not the case of a joke, but is done in a way to humiliate and to put down somebody. And then that last question is harm suffered. This really comes from the women's experience from battering scale, which is really identifying feelings of fear and dread that one might have in a relationship as a result of power imbalances that exist, or power and control strategies that an abusive partner is using. Our behaviors changed in some way to cope with the power imbalance and to reduce risk of abuse. Lost identity and sense of self. So we see some of that in some of the Disney princess films, although we touched on that very briefly today. Entrapment, including feelings of not being able to escape the relationship. Disempowered, let me back up and say isolation is the name of the game in domestic violence and teen dating violence, and abusers will often attempt to isolate the victim from friends and family, from institutional power that might otherwise facilitate their ability to be connected to resources that are helpful to them. And then other harms such as physical injury, depression, and stress. Shara, how am I doing on time? I probably need to stop here, right? So
You're okay, you have a few more minutes.
Okay, just a couple more minutes. I realize I'm talking fast. I've got a lot of material. So Dr. Megan Moss, when we were first looking at the virgin beast trope, we thought, wow, it'd be really interesting to apply the abuse litmus test to 3 of the most common, most popular films across different generational periods. So Beauty and the Beast, obviously for young children. Twilight is more of an adolescent film. And 50 Shades, young adult audiences. And I realized at this point, Twilight and 50 Shades are outdated, and there are more recent films, as were noted by the college students just a minute ago that I presented from class last semester. So when we looked at each of these 3 films and we overlaid the abuse litmus test, and then we asked, in these films, do partnership equal power? I'm not going to do the detailed analysis that we presented in our paper, but just a couple of things that stuck out to us that I'll point out. For example, Beauty and the Beast. The answer to this question across all films was no, there's not equal power in the relationship. So in Beauty and the Beast, Beast is an actual beast. He's not human. He's exceptionally strong, much stronger than Belle. Belle, the female, is a virgin who's never left her father's home, has never engaged in a romantic relationship before with a member of any sex, and all of a sudden found herself in a romantic relationship isolated from friends and family. Twilight, Edward is a vampire, which is a kind of beast. He's also cast as immortal and exceptionally physically strong, able to move things just by sheer force. Bella, again, in this film, is a young virgin, and notice very similarity in naming, so Belle and Bella. And then in 50 Shades of Grey, our detailed analysis, which I'll not talk about today, very stark power imbalances. So Christian's a billionaire who's physically strong. Anastasia is a college student. She's described as small and thin. He's described as, he's got Greek godlike looks, whereas she's described as plain by the author. The question 2, does one partner use power to control the other in these films? The answer is yes. So I'll use one example from this in the interest of time. Stalking, for example, in Beauty of the Beast is romanticized and wanting a desire to protect. So Beast uses a magical rose, if you remember from the film, to see how Bella will react to his threats. And he watches where she goes when she leaves the castle. He uses that to track her. In 50 Shades of Grey, Christian buys Anastasia a cell phone and a laptop to reach her at all times. And he tries to suggest that I'm just doing this because I'm worried about you and I want to make sure you're okay and safe. But in fact, she ends up calling him a stalker and feeling as if she's being stalked. And in fact, when we applied the national definition of domestic violence, there were very clear indicators of stalking. And then finally, is harm suffered as a result of the power imbalances in the relationship? The answer across all these films is yes. So for example, this last one, suffering harm to conquer all obstacles. In Twilight, Bella is depicted as often crying. She wants a healthy relationship, so it's an aspect of yearning. She observes normal high school peers coming out of a diner doing normal things, whereas she is isolated in a pickup truck with Edward in one scene, for example. She's very yet afraid of losing her connection to Edward. I'm only afraid of losing you, all afraid you disappear. And this is not an uncommon sentiment in relationships that are characterized by violence. So in summary, when we applied that, all three films didn't pass the abuse litmus test. Do partners share equal power? No. Is power used by one partner control the other? Yes. Is harm suffered as a result? I'm going to stop there. So my basic question is, do you agree with our assessment? Yes or no? You're not going to offend my feelings if you say no, but I'm actually going to turn it over to Sarah because I think she is probably going to facilitate a broader discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for those thought-provoking discussions. I think it's so important to take that critical lens as we look at media, and it's great to connect it back to what Rachel is learning from youth themselves and what their voices bring into this as well. So really appreciate you both and sort of looking at the full picture of what we're seeing here. So I want to invite our participants to put any questions they have in the Q&A, and we'll have some time. I have a few questions, and I also invite Dr. Bonomi and Rachel Kennedy to share questions of one another. But I guess to start out, I mean, I'm a mom of two young boys, so certainly I think it's so important to look critically at the media that we're consuming. And in the pandemic, I would say, you know, the amount of media that children are consuming has increased, although it's mostly Captain Underpants at this point for us. But I'm curious sort of what you're observing with this current generation of adolescents. I mean, I would say that there may be some additional sort of questioning of gender norms and relationship norms, and that, you know, I think there's a lot of sort of wisdom coming out of young people about how we look at some of these tropes. And I'm curious if you're seeing that or hearing that, or what your thoughts are on that.
Rachel, you want to start?
Sure, yeah. I'd say that, yes, I definitely saw a wide variety of how teens were perceiving not just like gender norms, but like gender expression, gender identity, and like kind of the whole dimension of like what gender is. I wish I could have had the ability to like look into multiple like other intersecting identities, because one of the things that actually got brought up quite often was that gender wasn't that big of an issue. The bigger issues were around age and trust. And so it was an interesting conversation because they would redirect it from gender things into other issues that they perceived to be more pertinent.
It's a super interesting question. So Rachel, thank you so much for your response there. My observation in interacting with students, so I most recently taught at Michigan State, and I'm teaching a class right now at University of Denver. And there's this movement, right, to change gender expectations, to be more expansive in our conceptualizations of gender and sex roles and whatnot. Yet I feel like our behaviors and practice haven't caught up. So for example, here my Michigan State students say, oh, gender doesn't matter. I'm good, right? I'm good with all gender. I'm identifying myself as non-binary. I don't think we should have these rigid roles. Yet in practice, what we see in organizations is still adherence to some pretty rigid gender role expectations around how female should behave, how male should behave. You know, thinking of a recent example in the New York Times, the astronaut who is female, who was as accomplished as all of her male counterparts. And yet the article that featured her was focused on how she was going to deal with parenting and childcare while she was up in space, right? And somebody had written an editorial about it. Like, none of the male astronauts were asked about how they were going to handle childcare and parenting, right? So we're still sort of stuck, I think, and entrenched in some of these gendered expectations. There was a really interesting question, and Rachel, if I could ask for your thoughts on this too, about, and Sarah, this is the one that you just popped in the chat. Somebody had asked, how do like threats of suicidality used by abusers used to manipulate victims in both adolescent and adult relationships? I speak from the adult side of things. We see it in almost 100% of domestic violence cases as one of the key manipulation strategies. Somebody had popped into the chat that Beast was kind of this pitiful, pathetic character. And often what we'll see is the abusers manipulate the victim's emotions to catch and pist himself as the victim in these relationships, including like, if you don't do this, I'm going to kill myself. Babe, do you want to see me suicidal? Because if you don't do this, then I'm going to do that. And Rachel, I'm suspecting the same is true in what you've seen in your data. So I'll stop there and ask you to comment.
Absolutely. And thank you also for your response to the question earlier. I wanted to follow up on that really quickly and say that I agree that I saw a lot of rigidity or a lot of flexibility in what they said were gender norms, but then what was actually being expressed in like advice and expectations was often reverting right back to those kind of rigid norms that we were seeing. So, but yes, and in terms of suicidality, suicide threat, I saw it in at least 20 to 25% of my participants, both in the qualitative and quantitative. It was very common for them to report that this was the primary tactic that someone used to keep them in the relationship. So whether it was sending photos of self-harm or threatening it, or there are several instances where people would send suicidal threats to another person who would get involved in the situation. So when it comes to teenagers, it got a little complicated because they didn't really know who was responsible, and it would get, there was a lot of circular communication that would go on. And a lot of times those situations would be very prolonged. But the presence of suicidal threat and suicidality were pretty strong across the board, unfortunately.
Sounds like we have a lot of work to do together, Rachel. I think, yeah, it would be great to talk more. There's a great question here from Dr. Diathesis about how it seems like the film examples involve the beauty taming the beast. How does that fit into theories of domestic violence? It's an excellent question. And Rachel, I welcome your thoughts on this too. So for example, I think I'll give you an example from Beauty of the Beast that we pointed out in our article, and then I'm going to talk more specifically about real world domestic violence relationships. So think about taming the beast. It's often about keeping the peace, not rocking the boat, trying to modify behaviors such as not to aggravate the abuser is kind of what we'll see. And one example from that film is, if you remember the scene where they're sitting at a dining table and Beast is at one end of the dining table and Bella's at one end, and Beast is drinking his soup from the bowl, like he's picking the bowl up and not using a spoon. The example that we point out, that she changes her behavior. She started out by eating her soup with a spoon, but then to make him feel more comfortable, right, she modifies and picks up her own bowl and starts to drink the soup. It's not exactly taming the beast, but it's modifying behavior to keep the peace. And I would say in the domestic violence relationships that I work on in the real world, there is this sense of, it's not necessarily taming, it's keeping the peace. So I'm going to make sure this is exactly in this place in the house, or dinner's going to be exactly this way. We're going to have this, and it's going to be done at this time, so that I can prevent, right, the abuser at the particular time from having a particular reaction. And we all know that domestic violence relationships contain a very rigid set of rules that the abuser uses to put boundaries around the victim. And so no matter what the victim does, right, the abuser sets it up in such a way that she's always going to be, quote, breaking the rules. And so it's an impossible set of rules is what I'm trying to say. It's an impossible set of rules, and it's an impossible set of being able to tame. I don't know if that answered your question, Carolyn. And if it made sense, or if you have additional thoughts on expanding our understanding there. And Rachel, if you have thoughts as well.
No, I thought you answered that really well.
Great. We have another question from Ashley Russell, wondering if there are examples of these narratives in video games. With the growing popularity of video games and increasingly immersive nature of them. Have you all observed anything with that?
I definitely observed some, if I can interject really quickly. I talked to several teens who, a question that came up quite often, or a question that I asked, because I just played dumb and often was quite ignorant of these questions, but one was, does platform really matter? So like if these conflicts are happening only on Instagram or only on text message or on a video game, because there were several gamers that I talked to who had met their partners or had engaged with people online or through anonymous servers. So I'd equate a good video game kind of more to that anonymous server. They can kind of be whoever they want to be. So something like Discord was a new common online platform. I don't know if you've heard of it. There's been a lot of talk about it, but in terms of like teenagers who met their partners through those platforms, they said that it made a huge difference in the kind of the two things that I had mentioned earlier, like establishing trust with somebody and setting those expectations for the relationship. It was drastically dependent on the platform, oftentimes the platform they met, if they didn't know the person beforehand. If they knew them beforehand or they had mutuals, it was maybe a little different. But again, a lot of these teenagers are meeting people during COVID, so they didn't have the opportunity to meet people in person. So a lot of these relationships were started online. So it's kind of an interesting trend. I don't know if Amy, you've seen anything similar in terms of like platform specific things and video games versus other media.
Yeah, well, I thought your response was so great, Rachel. I'm not admittedly very in tune with video games. What immediately came to mind when I saw the question, Ashley, and this is like totally outdated and antiquated, and I think speaking to my own naivete in the area, I was thinking back to in my human sexuality class at Ohio State, we used to use the film The Accused. I don't know if you all remember that. It was a film from the 1980s that depicted, it was based on a real world experience of a woman who was gang raped. And one of the things that we would talk about in class when we viewed it together was the scene where the rape occurred was done in a video arcade. So this is, again, back in the 80s, I think before online digital. What you're talking about, video games were present, but it was an arcade. And all of the images on the arcade machines were of very hypersexualized women. So there was a woman that was, for example, very scantily clad, and she was depicted as being dunked into a basketball net on one of the video arcades. And we talked about what the translation and the meaning of those visuals, on a both conscious and unconscious level, for our expectations of what's acceptable in our treatment. In this case, we were talking about a woman, this is gender identified woman. So I don't have a good answer to your question, Ashley, go back to what Rachel and I were just chatting about a minute ago. Even though there is this movement to have more discussions and expansion of understanding of gender, there's still this tendency to revert back to pretty traditional roles, even though somebody might say, I'm really open to this and I don't have rigid gender role expectations, but as Rachel's research showed, they do, and it's coming out in really highly gendered ways.
I really appreciate your responses to these and the discussion. And I guess I want to pose for you a question on sort of prevention and implications for those who may be working in clinical settings, maybe parents, maybe in education or school settings or public health. What do you think you would recommend around prevention, the strategies we should take? Who should be tackling these issues and trying to prevent this type of dating abuse?
Ooh, that's a big question. Amy, do you have anything to start off with? Or
yeah, no, I'm good with that. I was going to pull something up while you were. I'm happy to go first. I was trying to pull. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess in terms, I can speak while you're pulling that up. Some of the things that I heard from teens directly, I asked them a lot of times, like, how do you protect yourself online? How do you prevent these things from happening? Oftentimes they left it down to the individual, like digital knowledge, their social support system. But a lot of times what they emphasized most regularly was that it was really important to have some sort of accountability and support system online, whether it was like a friend or a peer or family member. There's very few people who talked to their parents, unfortunately. For those of you who are parents of teenagers out there, you're not likely to hear about a lot of these scenarios because they happen under the radar in this very secretive teenage world. But they do talk a lot about these things to their friends and their peers. And then there's also a lot of access to school counselors that I've seen a lot of. Interestingly, I didn't realize that was so commonly accessed, but a lot of them were accessing school-based resources. So that might be another option, but I lean more towards the online support for a lot of these teens.
I think so too. Thank you, Rachel. And to add to Rachel's comment there, I think there are things we can do. You know, you mentioned being a parent, or what can we do as parents, Sarah? So this guide was developed by Megan Moss, who we co-authored the Virgin Beast trope paper together. And this is intended for K-5 educators. So it basically takes the abuse litmus test and it breaks it down into a conversation that's simpler, that could be had between K-5 educators or parents. So, you know, when your children are interacting with these, whatever film it might be, it doesn't have to be a Disney princess film. It could be even video games, avatars, right? Who has power in those relationships? How do you see the power manifesting? And talking through a conversation of what power means with your child. Do they share their power? How is it shared? Is power used by one person to control the other? And again, it's not a constant, I feel, in relationships. It can fluctuate. Certainly in the severe cases of domestic violence that I work on, it's typically one person who has the power in that relationship. But in relationships more generally, we'll see some fluctuation in power, talking about what that looks like, talking about when it feels good, when it doesn't feel good, to have shifts in power occur. And then I think this guide is really helpful because it asks questions like, is Belle scared of Beast, right? So it puts it within the language of a child in this example in the K-5 kind of age range. And does Belle experience harm because of Beast? And I think we could expand the conversation and say, where do you see Beast experiencing any harms? Do you see Beast experiencing harms? Because to keep the dialogue open and equitable, we want to be exploring what's happening with all characters. So that would be my thought as well.
That's great. What a helpful tool. I think I really appreciate you both sharing that today and speaking with us. And I think we got through the questions from the audience. I'll wrap us up so that we can give folks a few minutes if you're doing back-to-back Zoom today. But thanks again to our presenters for joining and taking the time to present your research and your thoughts with us today. And thanks to everyone who listened in. And we hope to see you all in February at our next webinar.